In this video, we'll be discussing whether or not 1 to 2 million deaths was actually a possibility for COVID-19. Was it a hoax, or was it an important step in order to be able to protect human health? I'm Michael White, Distinguished Professor and Chair of Pharmacy Practice at the University of Connecticut School of Pharmacy. I'm both a pharmacist and a researcher. We need to start by discussing exponential growth. Exponential growth is very hard to understand, and it's very scary. One person over the course of 10 days who's infected with COVID-19 can infect 2.5 other people. And then those people can infect 2.5 other people over the course of the next 10 days, so that at the end of 60 days, the number of people who are infected is 406. So you can see how one person over a relatively small period of time can end up causing a situation where things can get out of control. 100 people can infect 250 people at 10 days, but 40,600 at 60 days. And think about this. 10,000 people with COVID-19 can infect 25,000 people at 10 days, but 4 million people at 60 days. You can see that if we can slow down the spread from one person infecting 2.5 people to one person only infecting 1.25 people on average, that we can reduce that from 406 people at 60 days all the way down to just 15. If we can do a better job and reduce the infection rate by 75%, we will end up at 60 days with just 2.5 people infected for every one person infected today. Let's keep exponential growth in mind as we go through some of this next information. On this slide, what you can see in blue is what's happening inside the United States as a whole, and then what's happening in orange in Florida. Let's focus on the blue line initially. This was mostly being driven by the effects in the New York, New Jersey, and southern Connecticut areas. And you can see that they were initially seeded much sooner than other parts of the country, and that their rates ended up going up exponentially for a long period of time before they began to bend there at the end of March. Now, had they not bended, I had given a line that ends up extending up to 100,000. So if we didn't take those precautions on March 15th in order to be able to stop gatherings of greater than 50 people and all of the other measures that were taken, at that point, this line would have continued to increase. And you can see that the U.S. would have hit 100,000 deaths on April 11th. But now let's look at the line just specifically for Florida. You can see they got a much later start. But this line that is going up of exponential growth is very, very similar to what it was in the U.S. overall. Not quite as steep, because they're not quite as closely packed as they were in that New York City region. But still, we would have hit 100,000 deaths just in Florida on May 1st. So by putting these things into place, the curve bended at a much lower death rate in Florida than it did in the New York, New Jersey, southern Connecticut region. But it still would have went there. The reality is that after it hit 100,000 in the United States, or after it hit 100,000 in Florida, within 7 to 10 days, it would have hit 200,000. And then 7 to 10 days after that, it could have gone up to hit 400,000. That's the risk of exponential growth. 7 to 10 days causing 100 cases to turn into 1,000, or 7 to 10 days causing 100,000 to turn into 200,000. We need to be aware of exponential growth. So it is easy to see how California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, the combination of Massachusetts and Connecticut, Illinois, and Michigan could all have had the potential for 200,000 to 400,000 deaths. And if they did, we could have been well on our way to 2 million overall deaths. Now let's look at it in a different way, looking at the overall acute complication rate from people who we know have had COVID-19 in the United States. You can see about 20% of people experience no symptoms, and about 50% of all people only experience mild symptoms. These people were contagious during that time period, but none of them had a severe course, and none of them ended up dying. However, 30% of those confirmed cases resulted in hospitalization, and 12% of them ended up with a very severe course in which 50% of those patients ended up dying. Using just this information, let's go through and make some calculations. If the United States has 325 million people and 2/3 of them need to be infected in order to induce herd immunity, we need to have 225 million people either be infected or be vaccinated in order to be able to have herd immunity. By May 13th, 1.4 million confirmed cases had occurred. It's estimated that the confirmed cases represent about 10% of the number of actual infections. So we can assume at this point that about 14 million people have been infected with COVID-19 in the United States. If we take the 225 million figure that we need for herd immunity and we subtract the 14 million, 211 million more people need to be infected in order for us to get herd immunity. That includes 21.1 million based on current testing standards who would meet the criteria for a positive test. So looking at that 21 million people, 7 million of those would end up being hospitalized, some of them for several weeks. 2.53 million people would need to be in the intensive care unit, and 1.27 million of them would die. So looking at it in the second way, between 1.2 and 1.4 million deaths are not unreasonable given our current trends. Now let's look at it a third way. 11 million adults in the United States meet the profile for having a severe outcome or death if infected. If we assume that 2/3 of U.S. citizens need to be infected to provide herd immunity, that means that 7.3 million would actually experience a severe outcome before herd immunity would help to protect the others. 1/2 of those severe outcomes could die. So when you put that together, we're looking at, by this third estimate, 3.6 million people at significant risk of death due to COVID-19. These projections are in a fully functioning, not overwhelmed healthcare system. If the healthcare system gets overwhelmed, the number of deaths will accelerate even more. Right now, among our most seriously infected, about half of those people were dying. But it could easily be 70, 80, or 90% if they don't have enough ventilators for people, if they don't have enough beds, if they don't have the medications that you need in order to be able to intubate people, if you don't have the medications they need for blood pressure support, if you don't have the dialysis machines for the people with renal dysfunction, if you don't have the blood products that people need, and all of the other healthcare resources that we need to have an adequate supply of. If we don't have enough personal protective equipment for healthcare workers and they start getting sick, we're going to run out of people to be able to care for the most sick. Just keep in mind, with only a critical outbreak in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, we almost ran out of ventilator capacity. Emergency hospital rooms needed to be constructed all around the city. A U.S. naval hospital had to be floated in. And hospitals had to look for alternatives for several different medications. And there were severe shortages of several medications. If this was occurring at the same time that it was also having something as bad in California, in Florida, or other major regions of the country, we would not have been able to stem the tide like we did. So as bad as it was, we had dodged a major bullet, and we can't lose sight of that. If we can slow down the spread of the virus, not allowing it to go back into that exponential growth phase that many of the states were beginning to experience at the time of the shutdown, we'll be able to buy ourselves time so that the health system doesn't get overwhelmed, to decrease the number of people that will have to be effective before we get a successful vaccine or a drug therapy that has the ability to reduce the deadliness of the virus. Those pieces are critically important if we're going to keep people safe. And we all have a role to play in making sure that that happens. So thank you for listening to this video. I hope that you found it useful. And I hope that you check out some of the other videos that we have.